I didn't know my entire life could be split into two different before and after moments. Not by an accident, not by an affair, not even by death, but by a lie. And then, years later, by a piece of paper that claimed I didn't own the home I'd been sleeping in for 5 years. The first after started with my husband standing in our small suburban kitchen at 9:00 p.m., still wearing his work coat, eyes cold like he'd already rehearsed the scene. I want a divorce, Andrew said. I actually laughed. This sharp little sound that didn't match the way my stomach dropped. I was 4 months pregnant. My hands were wet from dishwater. The air smelled like soap and boiled pasta. Stop, I whispered. What are you talking about? He didn't blink. Charlie saw you, with Lincoln, holding hands. Don't insult me. My throat tightened so hard it felt like I was swallowing glass. Lincoln, your stepbrother? Andrew, we had lunch. That's it. He leaned back like I'd proven something. And the baby? Is it even mine? That sentence didn't just hurt. It rewrote me in his mind, turned me from wife to criminal with one accusation. I remember pressing a palm to my belly like I could shield my son from the sound of his father abandoning him in real time. Call him, I said, voice shaking. Put Lincoln on speaker, right now. I did. Lincoln answered. Lincoln explained. Lincoln told the truth. And Andrew still walked out. The second after came years later, long after I thought I'd survived the worst version of myself, long after I'd built a quiet life for my son, long after I'd learned how to breathe through grief. I came home from an anniversary trip with my husband Thomas to a pile of mail, and one official-looking envelope addressed to a name that wasn't ours. Michael Reeves. Inside was a letter about a lawsuit involving our house. Our address printed in black ink like a threat. Thomas read over my shoulder and went pale. We've lived here 5 years, he said. That's not possible. But my hands were already trembling because I'd learned something the hard way. When someone decides your life is convenient to destroy, reality doesn't protect you. Paper does. 8 years ago, when I was 28, I still believed that if you love someone hard enough, you could outlast their fear. Andrew and I met in college, one of those slow, ordinary beginnings that feels harmless at the time. He was the kind of guy professors liked. Polished, confident, always speaking like he had a plan. I was quieter. I was working toward my nursing degree, the kind of student who highlighted every textbook page and carried snacks in my bag because I never knew when I'd get a chance to breathe. He noticed me anyway, not in some grand, cinematic way. More like he kept orbiting closer until it felt natural that he was there. He'd bring me coffee after my late lab. He'd walk me to my car even when it was raining. He'd remember small details, my favorite tea, the way I hated the cold, how I got tense before exams and pretended I wasn't. When he asked me out, he did it like he'd already decided the answer. Dinner, he said, smiling like it was inevitable. I said yes, and somehow it turned into years. We got married when I was 20. People love to romanticize that. Young love, soulmate stories. When you know, you know. But the truth is, I was 19 when my parents died in a car accident, and grief changes the shape of what you reach for. I didn't have a big, warm family to fall back into. I had a sudden silence where my whole world used to be. Andrew became the loudest thing in that silence. He made promises with an ease that felt like safety. He talked about forever like it was a real place you could build a house in. And when you're that young and that lonely, you believe the person who sounds certain. After we married, we didn't move into anything glamorous. We lived in a rental apartment in the suburbs. Thin walls, beige carpet, a kitchen that always smelled faintly like someone else's cooking. But it was ours. We bought a second-hand couch together. We argued over curtain colors like it mattered. I studied at the small dining table while Andrew worked in commercial real estate and talked about clients like they were chess pieces. It was ordinary, and ordinary felt like a miracle. The complicated part of loving Andrew, though, came with a name that never fully left our lives, Charlie. She was his best friend from childhood, someone he'd known since they were 6, someone his family talked about like she was stitched into their history. They dated all through high school. When they broke up because Andrew left for college, he framed it as a mature, respectful split. She's family, he told me early on. Not like that anymore. Don't worry. Charlie was the kind of woman who could smile while making you feel like you'd stepped into her space by mistake. She wasn't cruel in obvious ways, nothing you could point to and call out without sounding paranoid. She was present, always present. They texted every day. Not casual how's life texts, constant updates, inside jokes, little photos from their day. They had lunch twice a week like it was routine. If Andrew got good news, Charlie heard it first. If something upset him, Charlie got the phone call before I did. The first time it stung, I told myself I was being insecure. The second time, I told myself I had to be mature. By the third time, it wasn't even about jealousy anymore. It was about the quiet, aching question that started to sit behind my ribs. Where do I fit in if she's always already there? But I was determined not to become the jealous wife. I had watched grief turn people bitter. I had watched loneliness make people suspicious. I didn't want to be that. So I tried to be gracious. I tried to be modern. I tried to trust. And to Andrew's credit, at least at the beginning, he acted like trust was easy. He'd kiss my forehead while texting her. He'd say, "It's nothing," like he was soothing a child. Sometimes he'd even thank me for being cool about it, as if my discomfort was something I should apologize for. Then, 2 years into our marriage, I found out I was pregnant. I remember holding the test in my hand in the bathroom, my fingers shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. The lines appeared fast, 2 bright, undeniable marks. I sat on the edge of the tub, my heart thundering like I'd just run upstairs. I thought I'd feel fear, or at least uncertainty. Instead, I felt this strange, warm rush of meaning, as if life was finally giving me something back after taking my parents. I was so excited to tell Andrew that I didn't even plan it right. I just walked out into the living room, still holding the test behind my back like a surprise gift. "Andrew," I said, breathless. He looked up from his laptop. "What?" I held it out. "We're having a baby." For a moment, his face went blank. Not angry, not sad, just blank. Like his brain hadn't prepared for this possibility, even though we'd talked about kids before, casually, in the way couples do when they think time is endless. Then he smiled, slow, practiced. "Wow," he said, "that's great." He hugged me. His arms were around me. His voice was saying the right things. But I remember the way his eyes slid past my shoulder, unfocused, like he was already somewhere else. After that, everything shifted in small ways first. He started working late, almost every night. At first, I tried to be understanding. Real estate was demanding. He had deals to close. He was providing. But then he stopped touching me. It wasn't sudden enough to be a clear event. It was a gradual withdrawal, a hand that didn't reach for mine, a kiss that turned into a quick peck, a body that angled away from me in bed like sleep required distance. I'd sit beside him on the couch and try to slide my fingers into his, the way we used to. He'd pull away and say, "I'm tired." Tired became his shield. Tired became his excuse. Tired became the wall between us. And while I grew a baby inside me, while I felt my skin stretch and my emotions sharpen and my cravings change, Andrew became more absent, more unreachable. My doctor appointments happened alone. The nursery I wanted to paint together stayed empty, the walls still the same bland color as the rest of the apartment, like even the baby didn't have permission to exist yet. I told myself it was normal. I told myself men got scared. I told myself he'd come back to me once he adjusted to the idea of fatherhood, because the truth was too frightening to say out loud. That Andrew wasn't adjusting. He was leaving. And the worst part? I didn't realize he had already decided to go until the day he accused me of ruining him. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs everywhere, like cracks in glass you only notice once it shatters. At the time, though, each moment felt small enough to excuse. Andrew stopped asking about my day. Not in a dramatic way, just gradually. I'd come home from clinical rotations exhausted, my feet aching, my head full of medication dosages and patient charts, and he wouldn't look up from his phone. "How was work?" I'd ask him, trying to keep my voice light. "Fine," he'd say, and that would be it. When I tried to talk about the baby, about names, about how the doctor said everything looked healthy, his responses were polite but distant, like he was listening to someone describe a movie he didn't plan on watching. Charlie, on the other hand, seemed more involved than ever. She texted him constantly. I'd see her name light up his screen late at night when he thought I was asleep. She'd send photos of her lunch, memes, little commentary about her day. When Andrew laughed at something on his phone, it was rarely me he showed. "She just gets my sense of humor," he said once, when I asked what was so funny. I remember nodding, swallowing the sharp feeling in my chest. Sometimes Charlie would call while we were eating dinner. Andrew would step into the other room, lowering his voice. He said it was habit. He said it was nothing. And I wanted so badly to believe him. The pregnancies made everything feel louder. Every emotion arrived without warning. Some days I felt strong, capable, grounded, determined to be a good mother no matter what. Other days I cried in the shower because I felt like I was becoming invisible in my own marriage. I started noticing how Andrew avoided conversations about the future. When I mentioned daycare options or budgeting for baby supplies, he'd sigh like I was talking about something abstract and inconvenient. "Let's not stress about that right now," he'd say. But I was already stressed. I was carrying a life. There was no later for me. Then there was his family. Andrew's father, Jonathan, had remarried when Andrew was 15. His new wife brought a son with her, Lincoln, who was only a few years younger than Andrew. Andrew never accepted the new family. He barely spoke to his father. He refused to acknowledge Lincoln as a brother at all. "He's not my family," Andrew would say flatly. At family gatherings, Andrew stayed stiff and distant. Lincoln, by contrast, was always kind to me. He asked how I was feeling. He offered to carry things. He didn't treat my pregnancy like an inconvenience. I never thought twice about it. Until one afternoon, 4 months into my pregnancy, Lincoln texted me, "Hey, want to grab lunch? Haven't seen you in a while." I hesitated. I didn't want to cause tension. But it was just lunch, public, innocent. So I said yes. We met at a cafe downtown, one of those places with mismatched chairs and chalkboard menus. Lincoln talked about graduate school, about how overwhelmed he felt. I talked about nursing, about being tired all the time. It felt normal, easy. At one point, while I was describing how scared I was about becoming a mom without my parents around, Lincoln reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Andrew's lucky to have someone like you," he said. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds that would destroy my life. 2 days later, Andrew came home late, later than usual. It was exactly 9:00 p.m. I remember because I'd been watching the clock, waiting. I was in the kitchen doing dishes, the sound of running water filling the space where conversation used to live. He didn't kiss me hello. He didn't ask how I was. He stood there, silent until I turned around. "We need to talk," he said. There was something in his voice that made my stomach drop. Not sadness, not fear. Decision. I want a divorce. I laughed, this brittle, shocked laugh that didn't sound like it belonged to me. "Stop. You're not serious." He was. He told me Charlie had seen me at the cafe with Lincoln. He said she saw us holding hands, looking at each other in a way that made it obvious something was going on. I felt like the floor tilted. "That's not what happened," I said. "We talked. That's it." He didn't care. He said he knew I was having an affair with his stepbrother. And then he said the sentence that burned itself into my memory. "I don't even know if the baby is mine." I called Lincoln right there, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the screen. I put him on speaker. Lincoln explained everything, calmly, clearly. Andrew stared at the wall. When Lincoln finished, Andrew shook his head. "You rehearsed this," he said. I offered a paternity test. Immediately. I told him we could go the next day. He said it didn't matter anymore, because he couldn't trust me. That night, he packed a bag. He didn't look back. And as the door closed behind him, something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that would never fully heal. There are moments in life when time doesn't slow down like people say it does. It fractures. Andrew didn't slam the door when he left. He closed it carefully, almost politely, like a guest who didn't want to wake the neighbors. The click of the latch echoed through the apartment louder than any shout. I stood in the kitchen long after his footsteps disappeared, one hand gripping the edge of the sink, the other pressed against my stomach. My baby shifted inside me, small, unfamiliar movements that should have felt magical. Instead, they terrified me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like Andrew's cologne, replaying every word he'd said, every look he'd given me. I kept thinking that if I could just phrase it differently, if I could explain it better, he'd come back and realize how wrong he was. By morning, the hope had already begun to rot. Andrew didn't call. He didn't text. When I tried reaching him, my messages stayed unread. 2 days later, I found out why. Jonathan, his father, called me, his voice tight and confused. He said Andrew had shown up at his house briefly to grab some things and told him we were divorcing because I'd been unfaithful. "With Lincoln," Jonathan said quietly. Is that true?" The shame of having to defend myself while pregnant, while abandoned, felt unbearable. "No," I said, "it's not." Jonathan went silent for a moment, then sighed. "That doesn't sound like you." That was the first time anyone said that to me. 3 weeks later, Andrew's lawyer filed for divorce. Andrew contested nothing. Not the apartment, not the furniture, not the future we were supposed to have. He moved in with Charlie, across the state. and let his attorney handle everything like it was a transaction he wanted completed quickly. The most devastating blow came in a manila envelope, a form, termination of parental rights. Andrew signed it before our son was even born. When I read those words, voluntary relinquishment, I felt physically sick. I threw up in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the toilet, my body shaking with a kind of grief that didn't have language yet. He wasn't just leaving me. He was erasing our child. The divorce was finalized 2 weeks before my due date. I was 7 months pregnant, alone in a rental apartment I couldn't afford anymore, sleeping on a mattress on the floor because I had sold the bed frame to cover rent. I had no parents to call, no siblings to lean on. Andrew never asked how I was. Never asked if the baby was okay. Never asked if I needed help. Jonathan did. When he found out the full story, he drove 3 hours to my apartment. He didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He walked in, took one look at my swollen feet and half-packed boxes, and said, "You're not staying here." He helped me pack. He loaded his car. He insisted I stay with him until I figured things out. Lincoln took time off from graduate school to be there when I went into labor. He sat in a plastic chair in the hospital room while I screamed and cried and brought a child into the world without the man who helped create him. When my son was born, I named him Jackson. Andrew never called to ask if he'd arrived safely. Not once. 8 months later, I heard through Jonathan that Andrew and Charlie had gotten married and moved to Oregon for her job. That was the moment I stopped waiting for him to come back. Because he hadn't just chosen to leave. He'd chosen a whole new life, and I had to survive the ruins he left behind. The first year after Andrew left isn't something I remember in scenes. It's a blur of survival. I moved into Jonathan's house with a suitcase, a swollen belly, and the quiet humiliation of needing help at an age when I thought I'd be stable. Jonathan cleared out a room for me without comment. He bought groceries without keeping receipts. He treated my presence like it was the most natural thing in the world, and that kindness hurt almost as much as the abandonment. Because kindness reminded me of everything I'd lost. When Jackson was born, I felt two things at once: overwhelming love and a crushing sense of responsibility so heavy it made my chest ache. I was all he had. There was no shared night shift, no one to pass him to when my arms trembled from exhaustion, no partner to reassure me when I panicked over fevers or rashes or whether I was doing any of this right. Some nights I sat on the edge of the bed, Jackson asleep against my chest, staring at the wall and wondering how my life had collapsed so completely without me noticing the exact moment it happened. I blamed myself in quiet ways. Maybe I should have pushed harder when Andrew pulled away. Maybe I should have insisted on boundaries with Charlie instead of trying to be understanding. Maybe I should have noticed earlier that fear makes some people cruel. Those thoughts came most often in the early hours of the morning, when the house was silent and my body was too tired to fight them off. Jonathan never spoke badly about Andrew in front of me. That restraint made me respect him more, and also made the anger sit sharper in my chest, because someone should have been angry on my behalf. Lincoln was. He showed up constantly. He held Jackson so I could shower. He brought food. He sat with me during nights when Jackson wouldn't sleep and my nerves felt like exposed wire. He never crossed a line, never made things complicated. He was just there. And that steadiness saved me. As Jackson grew, life became more manageable. I finished my nursing degree. I worked night shifts so Jonathan could watch Jackson during the day. I learned how to function on very little sleep. I learned how to stretch every dollar. I also learned how to answer questions. "Where's my dad?" "He lives far away," I said. That was the truth, just not the whole one. For 6 years, Andrew didn't exist in our lives in any real way. He was a ghost I didn't speak of, a choice he'd made that I refused to let define my son. Then, one evening, an email appeared in my inbox. The subject line read, "Please read this. It's Andrew." My hands shook as I opened it, and with every word, I realized something terrifying. Andrew wasn't reaching out because he'd changed. He was reaching out because the consequences had finally caught up to him. I read Andrew's email 5 times. Slowly. Carefully. Like if I went fast enough, I might miss the part where it stopped being real. He wrote that he knew now I'd never cheated, that Charlie had never seen me at the cafe at all, that the whole story, the hand-holding, the looks, the betrayal, had been something they invented together. Not misunderstood. Invented. He wrote that when I got pregnant, he panicked. That fatherhood felt like a door slamming shut on his freedom. That Charlie had been telling him for months that he should leave me, that he deserved a different life, that she'd convinced him it would be easier to make me the villain than to admit he was afraid. It was easier to be angry at you than to admit I was a coward. That sentence lodged in my chest like a splinter. Then came the reason he was writing now. Charlie was dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. The same disease that had killed his mother when he was 12. Andrew wrote about watching Charlie deteriorate, about hospitals and scans and doctors who spoke in quiet, careful voices. He said it felt like punishment, karma. And because of that, he needed to clear his conscience. He said he couldn't face whatever came next. Death, God, the universe, knowing he'd destroyed my life with a lie. Then he asked if I could forgive him. And finally, almost as an afterthought, he asked to meet Jackson. I forwarded the email to Jonathan and Lincoln without adding a single word. Jonathan called within 10 minutes. He was furious in a way I'd never heard before. Not loud, controlled, dangerous. He does not get to do this, he said. Not now, not ever. Lincoln texted asking if I was okay, asking if he should come over. I said I was fine. I wasn't. For days, I walked around with that email sitting behind my eyes. At work, I caught myself staring at nothing. At night, I lay awake imagining Jackson's face next to Andrew's and felt sick at the thought of them sharing space. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell Andrew exactly what his lie had cost me. The mattress on the floor, the nights I cried alone in the shower, the way Jackson asked why he didn't have a dad like other kids, the years of exhaustion that no apology could give back. Another part of me wondered, quietly, guiltily, if Jackson deserved to know where he came from. That thought scared me more than Andrew's email ever could. I finally decided to respond, not to forgive, not to open the door, but to acknowledge the truth. It took me 3 days to write the email. I told him I didn't forgive him. I told him he would not have access to Jackson. I told him telling the truth 6 years late didn't erase what he'd done. He responded within an hour. He said he understood. Then he said he hoped I'd reconsider. Then he said he'd spoken to a lawyer. That was the moment I understood. This was never about forgiveness. It was about control. And once Andrew realized he couldn't manipulate me with guilt, he started escalating. The week after Andrew mentioned lawyers was the lowest point I've had in years. Lower than the divorce. Lower than giving birth without him. Lower than the nights I counted pennies and wondered how I'd keep the lights on. Because this time the threat wasn't abandonment. It was intrusion. Andrew's second email arrived late at night. I was sitting on the couch folding Jackson's laundry, the TV murmuring in the background. The house felt calm, safe in that fragile way single parents learn to treasure. The email shattered it. He wrote that keeping Jackson from him was punishing the child for Andrew's mistakes, that children need their fathers, that he wanted to start with monthly visits, maybe weekends. He wrote like this was a negotiation, like Jackson was a shared asset. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. My hands were ice cold. For the first time in 6 years, I felt truly afraid. Not of Andrew himself, but of the system that might give him a voice again simply because biology exists. I called the lawyer who'd handled my divorce. She still had my file. She listened quietly as I explained everything, then said, "Reinstating voluntarily terminated parental rights is extremely difficult, but that doesn't mean he won't try." When I hung up, I slid down the kitchen cabinet and sat on the floor, my back against the wood, my breath coming in short, shaky pulls. I forwarded Andrew's email to Jonathan and Lincoln. Jonathan called immediately, angrier than I'd ever heard him. He said Andrew had no right to threaten legal action after signing away his son like paperwork. Lincoln came over that night with printed text messages Andrew had sent him years ago, messages where Andrew said he didn't care if the baby ever knew who he was. Proof. Cold, ugly proof. The next morning, my phone rang again. A number I didn't recognize. It was Charlie's mother. She said Charlie was in the hospital, that Andrew had told her everything, that Charlie wanted to meet Jackson before it was too late. She said, "Surely you can find it in your heart to grant a dying woman's wish." Something in me went very still. I told her no. She cried. She said I was cruel. She said Charlie had made a mistake and was paying for it now. I hung up shaking. That night, Andrew called me directly. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, disappointed, accusatory, threatening. He said I couldn't keep his son from him forever. He gave me 48 hours. I saved the voicemail and sent it to my lawyer. She told me to block him. Jonathan came over the next morning and told me the truth about Andrew's past, about his mother's postpartum depression, about how Andrew learned to run from pain and blame others when consequences arrived. When he finished, he looked me straight in the eye. Do not let him do to Jackson what he's done to everyone else. That night, after Jackson fell asleep, I blocked Andrew's number. I blocked Charlie's. I blocked her mother's. And I cried harder than I had in years, not because I doubted myself, but because protecting your child from their own parent feels like standing alone against a storm. The turning point didn't come with relief. It came with clarity, sharp and unforgiving. 2 days after my lawyer sent Andrew a cease and desist letter, his response arrived through his own attorney. The tone was sterile, confident, rehearsed. Andrew now claimed he'd been young and confused when he terminated his parental rights. He argued that children need their fathers and that denying him access wasn't in Jackson's best interest. I read the letter at my kitchen table while Jackson colored dinosaurs beside me. My hands stopped shaking. Not because I wasn't scared, but because something inside me finally locked into place. This wasn't about Jackson. This was about Andrew needing redemption on his timeline. Jonathan offered to help pay legal fees. I refused. He insisted. We argued until I was exhausted, and then I agreed to let him help with half. Not because I needed saving, but because protecting Jackson mattered more than pride. Then Andrew crossed a line he couldn't step back from. He showed up at my hospital. I was on shift when the receptionist called and said there was a man in the lobby asking for me. She said he claimed to be my ex-husband and said it was an emergency involving our son. My stomach dropped. When I walked into the lobby, Andrew stood up like he'd been waiting for permission to exist again. He looked older, worn down, desperate. I raised my hand before he could speak. Stop. He said he just wanted to talk, that lawyers were getting in the way, that surely I could spare 10 minutes. I told him to leave. He refused. When security escorted him out while he yelled about rights and fatherhood, I realized something vital. Andrew didn't want to be a father. He wanted to win. That day, I filed a police report. My lawyer told me this helped my case more than anything else had. 3 days later, Andrew's lawyer withdrew from the case. Andrew couldn't afford to keep fighting. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt empty. The storm hadn't ended because justice prevailed. It ended because Andrew ran out of money. And that told me everything I needed to know. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, phone calls, silences, small confirmations that Andrew's world was finally collapsing under the weight of choices he'd spent years avoiding. My lawyer called first. She told me Andrew's attorney had officially withdrawn. The retainer fees were too high. Andrew's money was tied up in Charlie's medical bills. There would be no court filing, at least not now. The immediate threat is over, she said. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there staring at my kitchen wall. 6 years of fear, guilt, and rebuilding. And the man who destroyed it all couldn't even afford to finish trying to undo his own regret. A week later, Fiona called again from a different number. I recognized her voice immediately. She said Charlie was in hospice now, that she wanted to write me a letter, an apology. She asked if I could accept it. No, I said calmly. She cried. She said I was heartless. I said Charlie had 6 years to apologize while she was healthy. She hung up. 4 days later, Jonathan called. Charlie had passed away. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distant, like the chapter had closed without asking my permission. Andrew didn't reach out after that. Not immediately. 3 months passed. Then a letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, unfamiliar handwriting, my name spelled carefully. Andrew said he wasn't pursuing legal action anymore. He said he'd always regret what he'd done. He said if I ever changed my mind, he'd be waiting. I filed it away with the rest. I didn't respond. The real fallout came quietly. Jonathan became more present than ever. Sunday dinners, woodworking projects with Jackson, steady love without conditions. Lincoln stayed constant, teaching Jackson how to ride a bike, throw a baseball, exist confidently in the world. Andrew lost access not just to his son, but to the family that could have softened his worst instincts. And I didn't celebrate that loss. I simply accepted it, because the truth was unavoidable now. Andrew's life hadn't unraveled because I was cruel. It unraveled because he'd chosen fear over responsibility, and karma doesn't negotiate. I used to believe closure was something you earned at the end of pain. That if you waited long enough, suffered long enough, the universe would eventually hand you a moment where everything made sense, where the person who hurt you finally understood, apologized properly, and left you feeling whole. I don't believe that anymore. What I have now isn't closure. It's acceptance. Andrew didn't get redemption. Charlie didn't get forgiveness. And Jackson didn't get a father who suddenly learned how to be brave. What he got instead was consistency. He got mornings where someone always made breakfast. He got nights where someone always came home. He got a grandfather who never missed a Sunday dinner and a man who taught him how to ride a bike without ever demanding a title he didn't earn. And he got a mother who learned, slowly, painfully, that protecting your child doesn't require justification. When Jackson asked me if Jonathan was his real grandfather, I told him the truth. In every way that matters, I said. That was enough for him. It was enough for me, too. I still work at the same hospital. The security team knows Andrew's name. My lawyer's number is still saved in my phone. I haven't deleted the folder with all the emails, letters, and legal documents. Not because I'm holding on to anger, but because memory is a form of protection. Andrew may try again someday. History suggests he will. People who run from consequences often circle back when guilt gets loud. If that happens, I'll handle it. Not with rage, not with explanations, not with the hope that he'll finally understand, but with boundaries. Because here's the lesson I wish someone had told me earlier, one I hope anyone listening hears clearly. Forgiveness is optional. Access is earned. And being the bigger person does not mean reopening wounds so someone else can feel better about the scars they caused. My life didn't turn out the way I imagined when I was 20 and believed love was enough to save people from themselves. But it turned out honest and safe and built on people who showed up when it mattered. That's not the ending I wanted. It's the ending I needed.